Today I want to examine this concept of pattern interruption and the function that it can play for us, not as a motivational tactic, but as a philosophical necessity. Specifically, how breaking that cognitive momentum can momentarily free the self from its predictive loop and recover volitional bandwidth and reopen this question of self-authorship. And this is not about optimizing output. It's about figuring out a way to re-enter your own timeline when you feel stuck. When you feel stuck and you need to interrupt a pattern that maybe is working for you, but is keeping you too rigid, where you're overfitted to your situation. Because stuckness, feeling stuck, is not just a mood state. It's a condition of overfitted behavior. When your habits continue to execute after the originating rationale for those habits has expired, you are stuck. So the structure still functions, but the self does not. This is being stuck. So let's dig into why we get stuck and how to strategically get ourselves unstuck with pattern interruption. Obviously, today I'm in this place of interrupting my patterns. I really did not want to come down to take a few days off, but I did. And I'm not even going to tell you that it's paid off, because I'm not sure that it has, but I'm making the most of it, because I have been definitely in a loop where I feel overfitted to my situation, and I sense a lack of clarity where I can't transcend my circumstances to get a vantage point on my life to make the decisions that I want to make from a strategic vantage point. So let's dig into a few concepts that can really help us. So the first one is going to be a principle we've mentioned in previous videos, which is Karl Friston's free energy principle. So for Friston, the brain is a predictive engine. It survives not by discovering truth, but by minimizing surprise. And it achieves this by recursively updating its internal models to match expected outcomes. And when behavior becomes too successful at minimizing variance, or when your loops run too efficiently, then they cease to be adaptive, and they become self-sealing, and they protect prediction at the cost of perception. So this is the paradox of stuckness. It's not a failure to act, it's success in running a behavioral script that no longer epistemically or existentially is responsive to your circumstances. So interruption, then, pattern interruption, becomes the only way out. Not progress, not effort, not motivation, not pushing harder inside your system, but interruption. And this is a cognitive skill that we have to develop to make sure that we're not getting stuck, and that we should regularly be interrupting our patterns. Typically, when people struggle with things like habit or routine or discipline or regularity or stability, people who have too much chaos in their lives, it's all pattern interruption, right? But oftentimes what happens is when you implement these routines or structures of discipline, you can begin to swing the pendulum too far in the other direction, where you're so scared of letting that chaos seep back into your life because of all the negative consequences it caused for you, that now you think, I have to be structured, I can't break routine, I have to do this, I have to do that, and what happens is you end up losing yourself into a system. So there's a really useful concept here from a moral psychologist named Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Happiness Hypothesis. And Haidt describes the self as divided between two agents, where you have a rider and an elephant. So the rider of the elephant is the rational planner, and the elephant is like embodied instinct. And the rider justifies things, and the elephant will remember. So when a person is stuck, the rider becomes very verbose, and the elephant becomes immobile. And plans multiply, and there's a lot of chatter about what we want to do and planning, and you start leaning into the executive function, but the executive function isn't having proportionate results on your actual action. So you see yourself getting stuck, you see yourself slowing down, and you're like, no. You try to push your foot down on the pedal of willpower, and you still are slowing down. And you're like, something's wrong, right? So pattern interruption helps you re-engage a traction, a friction between the rational executive self and the primal behavioral self. So pattern interruption does not appeal to the rider. It reawakens the elephant. It grants the deeper self access to signals that have been drowned out by the noise of internal narration. And what returns is not clarity, but something prior to clarity, which is the felt possibility of movement. The importance of pattern interruption is that you reclaim and re-experience a remembered agency. So what does interruption actually do? Well, philosophically, pattern interruption is an induced failure of system closure. So temporarily, the prediction engine loses its confidence. It enters this liminal state, and for a moment, identity becomes writable again. This is not flow, this is not recovery, this is the discontinuity required to re-encounter the question, what structure is this behavior protecting? What structure is this behavior protecting, and who is it still serving? Even if it was serving me, is it serving me now? So the break itself, the pattern interruption itself, is the diagnostic. And if it's respected, if it's not rushed, this pattern interruption can become the point of re-entry into self-authorship, whereas previously you were overtaken and overrun and driven by a system that got out of control and is no longer lets you have your hand on the wheel of your life. So let's go into this concept of interruption. What is the danger of interruption? Well, the danger of interruption is reenactment, because most breaks, most pattern interruptions are consumed as escape and then folded back into the original loop. So, for example, this occurs when interruption, you do a pattern interruption and you're like, man, I've been working so hard, I just need to binge a Netflix show, right? And this occurs when interruption is used to numb rather than clarify. Not all pattern interruption when you're stuck actually is productive, right? This is why your body and your mind are trying to prevent you from pattern interrupting, because you're like, that's just a distraction. Like, that's literally going to be unproductive, right? There's no way that your habituated patterned self is going to see a pattern interruption as productive. So to avoid this, this wasteful pattern interruption, an interruption must be structurally dissimilar from the loop it breaks. It must avoid the logic of the system. If the loop is digital, then the interruption has to be analog, right? If the loop that you're stuck in is rigidly scheduled, the interruption must be unscheduled. If the loop that you're stuck in is socially performative, the interruption must be privately illegible. Right? You don't need an elaborate reset ritual. Like, you need a void large enough that your predictive model fails to fill it. And only then do latent volitional structures become audible in your mind's eye, in your mind's ear again. So let's look at some tactical ways to implement pattern interruption into our lives. So some practical gestures. Number one, we displace context. So go somewhere unmarked by your usual roles. This is hugely powerful. And stay there for a set amount of time. Even if it's like going for a walk in the park for 30 minutes, or for me it was this because I was in a really bad loop. Not bad loop, but I was in a good loop very badly. I was very stuck. And I had the horse blinders on, to a point that I realized I cannot make strategic decisions right now because I'm having trouble clicking into that higher level of thinking, right? So displace context is one tactic. Withhold output is another tactic. So make things without sharing them, or act without logging. Do things that are unlogged, unplanned, unrecorded, that don't leave a trace or an artifact. A third pattern interrupter is to actually suspend your goals. So choose acts that serve no immediate purpose. Another one is something I've mentioned before called lower resolution, what I call low res mode, or low poly mode, where you let yourself act crudely, without elegance or without direction. So these are not habits, these are ways to force disruptions, and they are useful only to the degree that they generate cognitive slack. And that slack can be used to listen. So there is a philosopher that I sometimes like and sometimes do not, named Martin Heidegger. And Martin Heidegger, in his book Being in Time, which he later disagreed with some elements of. Sorry, that's the philosopher me. Anyway, Heidegger in Being in Time, he writes that the self is most itself, not in routine, but in rupture, specifically when faced with the breakdown of the familiar. So he basically says that there's this uncanniness that arises when the world no longer shelters the identity. This Unheimlichkeit is what he calls it. And the interruption cultivated by Unheimlichkeit is this deliberate dehabituation. It's this small void in which the default self loses traction. And most people actually avoid this. Most people absolutely avoid this. It's this small void, right, that we instinctually resist. Most people will chase fluency, and they fear that interruption, and that fluency without volition is performance, and performance without presence is dissociation. And that's something that's very difficult to accept for a patterned self. And so I guess my closing thought on all of this is that we have to have this skill of pattern interruption when we are seeking meaningfully patterned lives. Part of a meaningfully patterned life is regular dehabituation, regular Unheimlichkeit, a regular interruption of our patterns in a way that's architected to like rocket boosters back into the transcendental perspective. Because a pattern will carry you into being somebody that you don't even recognize without your consent. And so the question is, do you really want to be that person? And are you giving your consent each step of the way to the pattern, right? So I think that oftentimes when people get stuck in patterns and stuck in systems, they think, I need a new system, I need a new pattern, I need a new routine, I need to figure out a new way to live my life because this one isn't serving me. It's like, well, maybe you don't need to become someone else, or maybe you don't need a new system. Maybe you just need to remember what it feels like to act from the center of your core self. And interruption doesn't deliver that, but it clears enough space for it to return. It gives you the opportunity to re-encounter the center of yourself and act from that place again. So without the opportunity, then it will not occur. So what the pattern interruption does is it's you giving yourself an at-bat at recatalyzing authenticity from within yourself so that you can act strategically in a way that is still patterned, but is directed and consensual. So set the loop break, and when the noise fades, which is the noise of the pattern, the noise of the routine, the noise of the stuck, don't rush. Don't rush through that silence. Don't rush through that void. Sit in the void as long as you can, because that's where the flavor of authenticity percolates. Okay? That's where, that's the fertile soil for consciousness itself to regrow. Listen, I'm trying to do that now. And don't listen for the next plan. Don't listen for the next behavior, the next goal, the next system. Trust that will come with power when the you that you are reawakens. Listen for the version of you that knew how to begin from the beginning. This is the power of pattern interruption.